Everybody, good morning. I am Jim Rodriguez, the Director of Trauma-Informed Services at the McSilver Institute for Poverty, Policy, and Research and the Community Technical Assistance Center of New York. And welcome today to Youth Justice Towards a Socially Just, Trauma-Sensitive Mental Health System of Care for Young People. I'm going to be joined today by Jason K. Jones, the Director of Learning Design and Innovation, and Diana Arias, our Senior Program Associate here at the CTAC. And as a couple of things as we move forward, if anyone has any technical difficulties during the course of the webinar, please chat in to our host, Kiara Caleb. She's going to be available if there's any to troubleshoot if you have any difficulties. During the course of the webinar, if you have any thoughts or questions that you want to shoot in, please feel free to chat those in, and we'll keep track of those. And of course, we will have a formal Q&A period at the end, so we'll bring some of those questions and thoughts in then as well as any other questions that come in during our Q&A period. Please remember, and actually a really important part of today is that we're going to ask for your thoughts and requests for more training in this space that we're going to be starting to talk about today. So please, at the end of today's webinar, fill out the survey and let us know if there are topics that you'd like to for us to go deeper on and address related to this topic, or of course any other topic of interest from you all. What we hope to do today is, one is recognizing that we're currently in a youth mental health crisis, and that we hope that today's webinar will provide an understanding of an approach to mental health care that integrates a few different areas: cultural competence and cultural humility, and anti-racist and anti-oppressive care and trauma-sensitive care. And so we're going to talk a lot about those areas where we can kind of bring together and integrate principles and ideas that each of those approaches provides. But also, we want to provide you with an overview of healing-centered engagement based on the work of Dr. Sean Ginwright. Many folks are beginning to talk about healing-centered engagement as an approach that really complements what we know about trauma-informed and trauma-sensitive care. So we're going to share a little bit of his work, focusing on one area that he talks quite a bit about, which is the importance of identity development in young people and how to promote healthy identity development among young people, and in particular, and especially social identity development among young people from marginalized groups and identities. Just as a quick idea of giving us who's out in the audience and give us an idea of who you all are, if you can, please chat in your name. Many of you have already done that, but also the setting in which you work with youth. You may not be working with youth, you may just be joining us because you're interested in the topic, but if you can give us an idea of what kind of setting you work in as you do your work with young people. Basis, here. Thank you for your names. Grade school social worker, so someone working in grade school. Outpatient clinic, clinician. OPWDD. Okay, outpatient health. So a lot of folks in outpatient care, caseworkers, folks working in schools. Okay, great. And I think some of the stuff that we're going to talk about today really kind of helps to address issues working with young people in a variety of settings. And we hope that the ideas that we're going to share with you today will be appropriate for your work in whatever setting in which you work with young people. And even for those of you who work with young people who are not yet adolescents, it sounds like we have some folks who are kind of preteens, working with preteens and elementary school children. Okay. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Diana Arias, who's going to share and do a little level setting for us.
Great. Thank you so much, Jim. So we do want to just get started by providing, as Jim was saying, information around the context of young people's lives. What is happening in society at large that can impact mental health? And we use the metaphor of a pendulum here because just as it seems that we are making progress, moving in a more inclusive, diverse, just direction, we swing right back. So I wanted to take just a little bit of time to look at a few examples here. So as we see progress made in elections and inclusion of members from the BIPOC community in historically underrepresented positions, we also unfortunately see the counteracting forces of white supremacy rising, as well as voter suppression efforts and attacks on critical race theory. As we see additional progress made through racial justice movements and the recognition of racism as a public health threat, we see a rise in discrimination and violence against members of the BIPOC community. And then lastly, as we see progress made in LGBTQ+ community, we also now see a rise in homophobia and transphobia and legislation targeting members of this group. And certainly most recently, we've seen reproductive rights come under attack, which can also have implications for other rulings. And all of that obviously affects us all, primarily youth who are witnessing that or experiencing some of those. And through research, we know that youth experience mental health challenges. For example, looking at trends from 2009 to 2019, surveyed high school students reported incidences of being bullied. 1 in 7 misused prescription opioids. 1 in 3 reported negative feelings such as sadness or hopelessness, and 1 in 5 considered suicide. And this was all before the COVID-19 pandemic. So as Jim was previously saying, currently we are in the middle of a youth mental health crisis. There have been spikes in emergency department visits and inpatient hospitalizations for youth who are presenting with depression, anxiety, suicidality, and eating disorders, to name a few. The Surgeon General's advisory report states that the pandemic exacerbated pre-existing risks and challenges for youth, but that they also experience other challenges within a relatively short period of time. We have well-documented police-involved deaths of Black Americans that led to massive protests across the country, a rise in racist and xenophobic violence and discrimination against Asians and people of Asian descent linked to the COVID-19 pandemic, the continuing issue of gun violence, political turmoil, and climate anxiety and grief. And we also can add a worsening opiate crisis as a result of lockdowns and financial hardships leading to overdose deaths. However, what we also know is that certain groups are disproportionately living with health risks and challenges. So when we look at race and ethnicity, multiracial youth report the highest rates of severe major depressive disorders. Meanwhile, American Indians and Alaska Native youth report the highest rate of lifetime major depressive episodes. Another disparity is evident in suicides, where Black children are 2 times more likely to die by suicide. And as I just mentioned, anti-Asian sentiment has risen drastically due to the pandemic-related xenophobic and racist narratives. Disparities also exist when we look at sexual orientation. So data trends from 2015 to 2019 indicated that lesbian, gay, or bisexual high school students reported higher rates of violence victimization, which includes feeling unsafe, threatened or injured, and bullied at school, as well as sexual and physical dating violence and forced sexual intercourse. They are also at higher risk for suicide as they reported persistent negative feelings, considered attempting suicide, actually made a suicide plan, and attempted suicide with a need for medical treatment. In regards to gender identity, gender expansive youth, so transgender or non-binary, report higher rates of mental health challenges, such as depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation compared to their cisgender peers. They also report greater rates of discrimination, victimization, and stigmatization. For immigrants, especially undocumented, we see high rates of depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, and substance use disorders. Stressors can include things such as changes in family structure, isolation, fear of deportation, and certainly discrimination. And we also know that unaccompanied youth are particularly vulnerable. So although we've covered just some mental health challenges based on single identities, clearly that's not how we live our lives. Youth's multiple identities, especially those from historically oppressed groups, intersect with each other and can create unique stressors and challenges. And we can see an accumulating layer of marginalization which impacts their mental health. So youth can become disempowered by racism, sexism, transphobia, ableism, and many other forms of oppression. So for example, an LGBT youth of color report the highest rates of housing insecurity compared to non-LGBTQ youth. And a common reason for this is family rejection due to their sexual identity. So not only are there disparities in mental health challenges for people from historically oppressed and marginalized groups, but there are also disparities within mental health care. So here you see some common issues that contribute to those disparities, including aspects of mental health treatment, such as access, eligibility, and quality of care, stigma as members of marginalized communities, lack of culturally competent or culturally humble providers and services, previous negative experiences in mental health treatment, such as racism, bias, discrimination, and misdiagnoses, concrete barriers, including language barriers, and certainly limited financial resources. And given the unique risks to youth from marginalized groups, it's critical that providers not only be aware of these issues, but also attend to them in order to increase service utilization. And as I wrap up this section, I just wanted to emphasize that mental health is influenced by multiple factors, as represented here from an ecological perspective, and specifically highlighting how cultural identities are impacted by each of these nested layers, from individual experiences to larger factors such as poverty, discrimination, racism, as well as being mindful of what this looks like for youth from marginalized communities. It's also important for providers to get a full story, or as full story as possible, when you work with people. Otherwise, we do risk we risk making we risk harming the people that we work with. So one way to do this is to actually practice socially just trauma-sensitive care in order to support the healing and empowerment of young people. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Jason Jones.
Awesome. Thanks, Diana. So when we think of socially just trauma-sensitive care, we're thinking of an approach to working with youth that encompasses several aspects. First, we're going to look at culturally responsive care. Then we're going to take a look at anti-racist and anti-oppressive practices. And then finally, we're going to spend the bulk of our time here today focusing on healing-centered engagement. So let's get started with the first. We've all heard of anti-racist and anti-oppressive care. So what do we know about racism? Well, thanks to the work of Dr. Robert Carter, we know that racial discrimination is a form of psychological trauma that can elicit similar symptoms to PTSD. For people of color, racial discrimination is related to higher rates of depression, anxiety, substance use, as well as several physiological effects. So when understanding the goal of anti-racist practice, it's quite simple. It's actively opposing all forms of racism, including beliefs, policies, systems, and behaviors. But it's not just an approach to care or an orientation. It really requires self-analysis as well as action. And that may include analyzing your own biases, your privilege, your power, as well as the origin of these things. But also understanding how that takes shape within the systems that we're in and actively working against those systems. Anti-racist practitioners seek to eradicate all forms of racism within their lives and their work with others, excuse me. So when we're thinking of anti-oppressive practice, it's not too dissimilar from anti-racist practice. It's just that anti-oppressive practice seeks to challenge and eradicate all forms of oppression, including racism. So AOP focuses on factors that promote inequality, inequity, and internalized oppression, and as well as things that limit access to social and economic activities. So when it comes to actually looking at anti-oppressive practice within our work with others, we're really thinking of egalitarianism as well as power sharing. So how can we actively work with someone and collaborate with them so that they understand that they're the expert in their own lives? Their opinions matter. What they say within the session holds weight, and that we're actively working on treatment planning together. We may have clinical expertise, but at no point are we the expert of their lives. So we really want to have that kind of power shifted within the dynamic with those that we're working with. Finally, culturally responsive care. Oftentimes when we think of culturally responsive care, we're thinking of things like having interpreters within our organizations, or even changing the language of our written materials so that it really accommodates many folks. That's part of it, but we're also looking at understanding that everyone is culture, including yourself. And culture as a key form of identity really impacts our perspective, how we see the world, and how we interact with others. And it's the same for the folks that we're working with. How does their culture really impact the space? How do they interpret what's happening from a cultural lens? And how do we work with them to do that? It also requires cultural humility, which I know we just touched on a little bit, but it's the idea that you can never learn too much about another culture or about yourself. There's no finite amount of information that you can have. What we're trying to do is continuously learn, as well as commit ourselves to that continuous learning process. It requires some self-analysis, addressing your own biases, your own privilege, the power that you have. And it's also asking the tough questions. I think that sometimes as practitioners, we often shy away from asking about instances of racism, discrimination, gender-based violence, any areas of oppression. But what's important to note is that saying those things, giving them their own space with our work with others, really allows folks to be vulnerable, allows them to express themselves fully, and it really allows us to work with them on improving outcomes overall. So with that, I do want to take a few minutes to play a quick video. And just to give you some context, Jade is a Trinidadian American high school student who recently got in trouble with her teacher. We're going to walk through the encounter and then see how the clinician works with her, really including aspects of culture, but also trying to partner with her within the session. So we'll just play that for a few minutes and then we'll unpack it. Can folks hear the audio? It may just be me. Okay, so I think we'll need to work on that. Can we retry it, Kiara?
Yes, let me try one more thing and I'll see if I can get the audio working for everyone.
Thank you.
I wrote it myself. This is a college level essay. You have a C- average in this class. How do you explain that? Well, this is the first book on the syllabus I actually liked. Toni Morrison is one of my favorite authors. Maybe I'd write better essays if we didn't read boring books by white men all the time. Now, don't pull the race card, Jade. The race card has been pulled ever since I popped out of my mom's black ass uterus. I'm not pulling anything. You're just being disrespectful, as always. So we go back and forth for a minute and things start to get heated. I'm late for class, plus I'm not trying to lose my voice over someone who don't want to hear me, so I try to bounce. Jade, don't you dare leave until you tell me the truth. I told you, I wrote the goddamn essay. Fine. You just keep on lying and cheating and you'll end up in jail, just like Nikolai. Now that set me off. I get real defensive about Nick. You keep my brother's name out your lipless ass mouth. I was mad heated. I knew it was a mistake as soon as I said it. So I tried to leave before I say anything else I regret, but fuck you, racist bitch. I don't know what came over me. As soon as she grabbed me, it was like an out-of-body experience. I just reacted. Then she called the cops on me and they put me out of math class. They said I sprained a wrist or something. And now I'm here. Jade. I know. I shouldn't have used that language. I should have just controlled my reactions. That's not what I was going to say at all. I was going to say thank you for sharing that. And I'm sorry that happened to you. What? The way Mrs. Thomas accused you and spoke to you was racist. You didn't deserve that. And she definitely shouldn't have touched you. No one's ever believed me when I said a teacher was racist before. And I'm sorry for that too. You deserve to have adults in your life who listen to you. Jade, have you experienced any other significant or stressful life events lately?
No, not really. No one's died or anything.
Well, it doesn't have to involve anyone dying or getting hurt. It could be a new addition to the family, the loss of a job, a recent move.
Well, my brother just got out of juvie, and I deported my dad back to Trinidad. Those count.
Yes, those definitely count. I totally know what you're going through.
You had a brother in juvie and a dad who got deported.
No, not exactly.
So you don't know what I'm going through. And I don't need you to sit here and act like you do.
You're right. I don't know at all.
Why do adults always assume they know everything?
I misspoke. I shouldn't have said that. I apologize.
Thank you. And I know a few folks have asked, can we play it from the beginning? What we missed in the beginning was Jade's teacher essentially cornering her and accusing her of cheating on a paper that she recently submitted. So why we wanted to show that was because I think it's a powerful exchange of a few different ideas. One is that Jade felt really comfortable to actually finally express the microaggressions that she was experiencing, finally express the racism that she was experiencing, and really tell her side of the story. And what we didn't see within the video, within the beginning portions of it, was the clinician really creating that space for her, asking her about culture, talking to her about some similarities that they may have, and also just trying to partner with her in that way so that she did get to the point where she felt comfortable. You also noticed that Jade said that, no one's ever believed her when she said that a teacher was racist. No one's ever thought, the student might actually be telling the truth. And I think that's something that oftentimes happens to young people because we don't give them the space to express those kinds of things. Cultural responsiveness requires us to have these difficult conversations and to hold that space for young folks. And then at the end, what you finally did see was what happens when we tend to overstep. And that's part of the fear when it comes to having these types of conversations. What if we say something wrong? How do we recover from that? And skillfully, the clinician then said, I apologize. What we didn't see after that was, do you want to continue with the session? How can I really improve this practice? So it's those kinds of things that really go into cultural responsiveness. And hopefully that takes away a little bit of the fear that's there. So, sorry, I'm trying to advance the slide. Okay. Why is that important? Well, it's important because marginalization is traumatic. It's a traumatic experience for anyone, but particularly for young folks. It negatively impacts their well-being, their functioning, and the effects are cumulative. So when we think about microaggressions, we often hear the idea of death by 1,000 cuts. It's these little things that continuously happen. And the first time we may not think of it, but after the 100th time that it happens for the day, it starts to weigh on us. It starts to impact us. And we could see how that plays out, not only in our mental health, but also in our physical health. What we learned about marginalization is that it really does lead to physical harm, as well as exclusion, further exclusion from society. And it also leads to, it creates barriers to social and economic opportunities. What we're trying to say here is that through these various practices, ideally, we would be decreasing these instances for young folks. And my apologies, I'm no longer able to advance the slides. Kiara, can you advance to the next slide, please?
Yes.
Thank you. For some reason it's back. Okay. How trauma can impact youth development. So I'm going to go through this pretty quickly, but we know that at many times things that we're looking for, things that we're seeing are avoidance of activities, interpersonal difficulties, anxiety, and mood problems. We often then label these youth as hyperactive or oppositional. We say that they're not able to form trusting relationships, and we assign them these labels and these diagnoses without really taking time to think about the trauma that they've experienced, but also giving them space to express that with us. So I do want to spend some time talking about healing-centered engagement. As Jim mentioned, it is an approach by Dr. Sean Ginwright. But before we do that, I do want to have an opportunity to hear from all of you. Let's chat. So what are some negative ways that young people are portrayed in society? Feel free to just throw in some things in the chat and we'll just go through them. Great. They're labeled as lazy, risky, violent, reckless, defiant, impulsive, rude, troubled, entitled. Absolutely. And do you think that all of these labels have an effect on the young people that we're working with, and even those that we don't have a chance to see? Absolutely. Disrespectful, yes. And what about your settings? What is negative language that you use, or not you, but you have seen used within the field? Hyper, oppositional, angry, attention seeking, combative. I've heard that a number of times. Defiant, oppositional. I'm seeing defiant a lot. I'm starting to get the hint. And finally, what are more positive or fair ways to talk about young people? What are some of the words that we can use to really describe them that help uplift them? Resilient, learning, independent. Absolutely. Assertive, creative, introspective. So a key part of what we're saying here is that we can actively help youth heal and grow through the language that we use. And that's part of the framework that Dr. Ginwright really brings forth in healing-centered engagement. So I'll go through this quickly, but we're gonna really key in on some particular aspects of it. So to give you the definition, healing-centered engagement is a process that aligns institutions with a perspective, approach, and strategy that addresses harm and restores well-being. It supports systems with shifting from a culture of harm, discipline, punishment, and confinement to restoration, hope, and healing. So what does that mean? Well, as Dr. Ginwright explains, he found that when he was meeting with young people and really talking through trauma, unpacking their experiences, what they said was trauma doesn't define them. They don't want to be defined by the worst thing that's ever happened to them. What they actually wanted to do was not only work through their trauma, but also talk about their hopes, their dreams, their aspirations, and how to get there. They wanted to focus on what they needed to add to themselves to actually reach their goals. So healing-centered engagement came about not as a replacement to trauma-informed care, but really in addition to it. It expands upon it by looking at holistic healing. So the framework is strengths-based. Rather than asking young people questions like, what's wrong with you? It asks, what's right with you? What are your hopes and your dreams? What's important is that it recenters culture and identity. Within healing-centered engagement, we understand that identity and culture are some of the key pieces of who a young person is. And identity is one of the first things that's harmed, right? So we saw within Jade's case, her identity was harmed as an African-American, as a Trinidadian American. She talked about how she wasn't able to just express that she was experiencing racism or microaggressions, a clear harm to her identity. Healing-centered engagement tells us that we have to restore the identities of our young people for them to be successful. It also considers the root causes of trauma in the environment, not just the individual. So rather than focusing on the symptoms of the person, we're also looking at what's it like within their environment? What are some of the toxic things that they're having to deal with? And how do we combat that? How do we engage them to combat that? Whether that's through civic engagement or any other means of really changing their environment as well. It's also asset driven. So we look at the strengths of the individual and we also look at what are their goals and what do they need to reach them? How can we help them and how can we support them in that way? And lastly, it's a parallel process. So at no point can we be fully helpful to young people if we're not healing ourselves. Healing-centered engagement asks us to really look at what are the things that are impacting us? What are the toxic things within our environment? What trauma have we experienced? And how do we heal from that in order to better help others? So when we think about trauma, we often think about the adverse childhood experiences. We think about these risk factors that we see, such as physical and emotional neglect, substance use, domestic violence, divorce, or homelessness. But with healing-centered engagement, we're also looking at what's beneath the surface. How do we go deeper? We're looking at the root causes within the environment: poverty, discrimination, violence, lack of opportunity. Finally, I just want to end this portion by saying one simple way of thinking about healing-centered engagement is through the evolution of trauma. moving from what's wrong with you to what happened to you, and then adding other questions. So what's right with you? What can we do to help you heal and grow? And what supports do you need to get to where you're going? So with that, I'll move it on to Jim so that he can talk more about healing-centered engagement.
Thank you, Jason. So, Dr. Jim Wright, based on sort of his thinking around healing-centered engagement, has proposed 5 principles that guide healing-centered engagement, and these help to guide our work with young people. Again, especially young people, not only, but especially young people from marginalized groups and identities. And he's identified these principles as ways to help them heal and grow from trauma and adversity. And so the principles include a focus on culture. As Jason has already talked about, when we think about culture, is really focusing on the notion of identity and how our social identities, our group memberships, impact us, both positively and negatively. He also talks about agency, building agency, helping young people develop a sense of agency in their lives, a sense of control to counteract the hopelessness and helplessness that can derive from exposure to any form of trauma, and in particular forms of marginalized trauma. And then developing relationships with young people, which we all know, and again, it's repeated over and over again, what is one of the most important protective factors in the lives of young people is the quality of the relationships around them and in their lives. Of course, principally their relationships with family members or families of choice, with their peers, with mentors, but of course, teachers, professionals, social workers, case managers, clinicians out there. All of these can become critically important relationships in the lives. And one meaningful relationship can turn a young person around and help to form and create the protective factors that they need to help them move on with their lives. He talks about helping young people develop a sense of meaning in their lives. Primarily what he talks about there is identifying their assets, helping them to identify their strengths. And in my work with young people, I know we all know that oftentimes this is one of the things that can happen is it is difficult for young people to identify their strengths. When you've faced a life where you were constantly told, as earlier you were sort of identifying those ways in which society sees young people, all those labels that we put on them, manipulative, attention-seeking, entitled, all those things that we carry. We oftentimes, young people are aware of those messages. They internalize those messages and oftentimes begin to develop a sense of hopelessness and helplessness. So meaning, helping them identify their strengths and assets. And then lastly, aspirations, helping young people identify and express their dreams and hopes. So we're going to focus today primarily in that first area of culture for 2 reasons. One is, as we were looking at this material and what Dr. Jen Wright had to say and these various principles, we thought it was a lot to cover. And so what we're going to do is we're going to focus on that first one. But we also, later on, will get your thoughts on some of these other areas and how we can continue to do and provide offerings in this space to go deeper in the other areas and these other principles. So again, healing-centered engagement focuses on helping young people develop a healthy sense of identity with a focus on their social identities. Healing-centered engagement recognizes that for all of us, social identities defined by race, ethnicity, our gender, our sexual orientation, our gender identity, our age, our immigration status, religion, and many other factors. That is what defines culture. If you're working with someone who's Asian American, that person could be young or old. That person could be recently arrived or here for generations. That person could be gay or straight, trans or cisgender, right? There are all these different factors. So when we think about culture, it really is about this integration of social identities. And in a society where the mainstream has historically been defined by white, male, heterosexual, cisgendered, Christian norms, discovering a healthy sense of identity, our social identities, especially when they're marginalized identities, becomes incredibly important because there are harms, there's danger, there's healing that needs to happen with regards to our sense of identity and how we view ourselves. And so when we think about youth development and identity, we also know this is a little bit of, sort of Erickson and sort of Psych 101 and social development, right? It's a central task of adolescence. And centering identity development as a way towards healing young people makes sense because it is the central task of adolescence. Identity development is considered to be that major task. Successful resolution of that task can lead to a healthy self-esteem, a healthy direction for your life, understanding where you are in the world and where you stand in the world, how you're seen by others, how you see yourself. Unsuccessful resolution can lead to identity confusion. We're literally strangers to ourselves. Let me ask, how many folks out there work with either young people, and I do with young adults, who continue to, even as older adults, have difficulties really knowing who they are and feel like they don't know themselves? Right? I'm seeing a lot of yeses, thank you. Right? And so oftentimes, and this is demonstrated, right, with young adults and older adolescents, it's demonstrated with things like, one day the young person wants to be an artist, the next day they want to be, a basketball player, the next day they want to be an entrepreneur, the next day they want to, these are all demonstrations of ways in which young people are telling you that they're still trying to figure out who they are in the world, right? And that's just broadly identity development, right? Our sense of self and who we are. And oftentimes, a healthy sense of identity helps us make decisions about our careers and our life partnerships and how we decide how we're going to live our lives as adults. But it also means, in the sense of social identity, it also means this importance of a collective identity based on our membership in a specific group or groups, right? Including all those components that I mentioned earlier: race and ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation. And then, of course, when we think about intersecting identities, as Diana was talking about earlier, and Jason was alluding to, intersecting identities, right? What it means to be a Latino cisgendered male, or a Black woman, lesbian woman, right? All of these things are integrated and gives us a sense of who we are and our understanding of the world. So applying the issue to social identity to culture, it's about making meaning of the world based on our experiences around those various social identities. And these processes can be compromised by the trauma of marginalization. So let me show you what I mean, right?
Rival gangs creating anarchy.
Which are gang busted.
Sorry, Jim. Do we want to play the video now?
Yes.
Los Angeles today.
Epidemic of violence.
Gang members roam the streets.
These are animals. Animals, savage, vicious, criminal gangs, bloodthirsty killers.
Is it possible that those kinds of messages that we hear often and every day can lead to this?
Which doll is the black doll? And which one is the white doll?
That one.
Which doll is the pretty doll? Which doll is the nice doll? Which doll is the bad doll? Which doll is the nice doll? And which doll is the bad doll? And why is that doll pretty?
Because he's white and he has 2 eyes.
Which doll is the ugly doll? Why is that doll ugly?
Because he's black.
Which doll looks most like you?
Like me?
Yeah, which one looks like you?
Thank you. Kiara, can I get control of the slides again?
Yes.
So as we think about that scene, I just want to be clear, right? That the way that the trauma of marginalization works is in the many messages that young people, even young children, can hear oftentimes. And I'm not going to suggest that these young children who are in this video might be exposed to that, but they might be, right? Young children could be listening to the news, could be hearing the news. They could be hearing their parents discussing and talking about the impact of those kinds of statements and characterizations of young people, right? But even outside of those statements, right, how the trauma of marginalization works oftentimes is the way young people are treated by race. You know, even at that young age, African American children, mostly boys, account for nearly half of the children expelled from preschool, although they represent only 18% of the population. Right? This is what we often refer to as the school to prison pipeline. And oftentimes the trauma of marginalization occurring at such an early age begins to sort of seep in and result oftentimes in internalized racism and oppression. Kiara, I need to keep advance. Can you advance for me? Next slide. So, so as we think about identity development, let's talk about how identity development works. This is based on the work of Marcia and Tajfel and Finney and Erickson and others, and so putting together a number of different thinkers on this issue. The identity exploration process is conceptualized as occurring along two intersecting dimensions. One being crisis, otherwise known as exploration, and the other one being commitment, the degree to which we commit or feel a deep, actualized sense of identity. And so if you think about those two dimensions perpendicular to each other, creates four possibilities, right? So one could be have a diffused identity in that lower right corner. That is someone who's never explored or thought about their identity, regardless of what part of their identity we're talking about, their self-identity, their social identity, their career identity. They haven't explored it, they've never thought about it. And so, of course, there may not also be any commitment to it, any firm commitment to them as committing to that part of their identity. And then you could have moratorium, where there is some exploration, some understanding, some thinking about that aspect of your identity, but no commitment yet. You're just sort of playing with these ideas and trying to better understand what it means to be, you can fill in the blank, what it means to be a person of color, what it means to be gay, lesbian, what it means to be, gay, lesbian, straight, what it means to be a man or a woman in our society, right? So beginning to sort of question what those things mean. And then in the upper right-hand corner, you could have a foreclosed identity. No exploration, but a commitment. So an example of this might be someone, and this is just a typical example, a young person who grows up and wants to be a lawyer because their parents wanted them to be a lawyer, right? They have this commitment to a future as a lawyer, but it's not something that they chose. It was chosen for them. They've been socialized to sort of believe in it, right? So a commitment to want to do that, but no exploration of it, no exploration of other possibilities. And then the last quadrant on the upper left hand is achievement. It's this deep sense of understanding of yourself and who you are in the world based on deep exploration of the various possibilities. Now, when we think about these four quadrants, and we think about social identity, in particular, how we feel about ourselves regarding our race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, so on and so forth, then we can think about this, right? Unexplored social identities. I mean, we've never thought about it. So, for example, those young children in the video really have not really explored what it means to be Black or African American, right? They've never really had that opportunity. We do know that young children, as young as those ages of preschool, oftentimes do already have internalized racial hierarchies developed in their minds because of many of the factors I've already talked about. But it's unexplored, right? There may be mainstream acceptance of norms, right? So again, those children are demonstrating mainstream acceptance of what norms we have around definitions of beauty and of goodness, right? That's what you're seeing playing out in there. Those young children have internalized that white is right, white is beautiful, white is good, and Black is not, right? And it can also sometimes lead to colorblindness. This idea, and this could be both for people who are in the mainstream as well as for people of color and other marginalized identities, colorblindness, right? So many people in later years who talk about being colorblind, right? There's no exploration of what it means to be white or Black or cisgendered or trans or any of those factors. It's just, I believe that everyone is the same. And while it's an understandable and possibly positive intention, it also can be damaging at times because it takes out the possibility that young people's experiences around those things because of the trauma of marginalization are not being understood, and their challenges and also the ways in which their identity restores them and helps them feel connected is important. Right? And then moving along, so moratorium is this identity search, experimentation, trying to understand ourselves as, again, fill in the blank, as a person of color, as a Black person, as a white person, as a Latino, as a male or a female. So there's an exploration of understanding, what does that mean to me? There might be experimentation with different forms of that. We often see that in college, right? Some people, especially during those college years, begin to become more ethnic in their clothing and in their culture, trying to connect more to their cultural roots and their ethnic origins and any other sort of aspect of their social identity. So there's experimentation about how do I best live out my life as a social being. And there could be high emotionality, right? And I think we see this with Jade, right? Extremely triggered by, understandably so, by the events that took place by that teacher, right? And her understanding of herself as a young Black woman. Right? And then as we think again about the upper right-hand quotient for closed, attitudes could be positive or negative. There's an awareness of social identity, there's awareness of differences, but there's no unexplored commitment. And so oftentimes this could be people sort of living lives defined by, again, others. It might be others defining for them what it means to engage in a particular cultural group. For me, growing up in a Latino Puerto Rican family, the traditions of our holidays and how we lived our lives sort of helped me feel connected, but there wasn't necessarily an exploration until much later, and I should say until I began to experience forms of racism in my own life. But feeling connected to that group without necessarily exploring could be positive or negative. And then lastly, an achieved identity, it's acceptance of self and others, fully confident in who you are as a social being, calm, you're secure in your social identity. Oftentimes, the person we often think about in that achieved identity, and oftentimes it's difficult to achieve, but we often think about Martin Luther King, for example, someone who clearly was connected to his race, understood what it meant to be a Black man in society, but also preached and talked about unity and talked about understanding across races, right? That's the ultimate goal of social identity development, is to be able to have a firm and committed and achieved sense of your identity, but also accepting of others and people and out-group members. So that's the process. And then what drives this process, and this is why we go back to the small clip that we showed you a little while ago, is what drives this process is encounters, right? So as Jason was saying, when we think about being exposed to a lifetime of information about what it's supposed to be, what are the norms, again, oftentimes driven by predominantly white, male, cisgendered, heterosexual society, right? Oftentimes, the messages that we receive in those explicitly or implicitly are that there's something wrong, there's something different about non-white, non-cisgendered or transgendered or members of the LGBTQI. There's something wrong with those identities. And so, and it could be oftentimes, as we think about it, it could be microaggressions, it could be direct forms of or overt forms of racism or covert forms of racism that begin to sort of drive in the person that there's something wrong and there's something I want to explore here and something I want to understand better. That's what drives the process. And so, and just very quickly, for folks who sort of aren't familiar, we often talk about, again, this notion of microaggression. So microaggressions oftentimes, again, are the grist for the mill for social identity development. So microassaults, and there's forms, different forms of microaggressions, microassaults. So those are the overt forms, intentional forms, being called a racial epithet, being spat upon because of your race, all these other direct forms of racism that are not ambiguous at all and not covert. And then there's micro insults, right? Messages or actions that communicate disrespect of a group. Young people hearing that's gay. If you are a member of the LGBTQIA community, that's disrespectful. But hearing those kinds of comments, so those kinds of insults, and then micro invalidations, comments or actions that dismiss the experience of a marginalized group. I don't really see you as Black, right? That colorblindness, right? I don't see you. When you say that to someone, what it says to them is, I don't see you, especially if someone really connects to what it means and feels that it's important in their lives and significant in their lives because of their race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, right? So a lifetime of those kinds of exposures can lead to that questioning and that process of deep exploration. And so what can we do, right? So what do we do? For me, this work is so significant because it highlights the importance I've long thought about. How do we overcome internalized oppression, right? All these forms of oppression really can lead to that internalized oppression, those children that you saw on the video. And I've always thought, well, how do you address that? How do you counter that? The reality is that internalized racism and oppression oftentimes is the ultimate goal of the oppressor. Once that oppression and racism is internalized, the job of the oppressor is done. And so how do we combat that? Well, we kind of saw some examples of that in the video earlier, right? The first thing that we have to do is be clear and understand and accept that racism exists. And so the objective is often to allow participants, allow the young people that we work with to share and process their experiences with racism and discrimination in all its forms. This is the way they process those experiences and begin to sort of develop a more cohesive and better understanding of themselves and their social identities as social beings in the world. And that takes two things. That takes the work of you all as providers, exploring your own biases, and we have to recognize that they exist. I won't go into a full dissertation about how they exist, but implicit biases exist. We all have them, and we all carry them. And so it is understanding that we have them, exploring those, and accepting those as part of who we are, and being open to discussing the elephant in the room when these issues do arise, when young people do share experiences or stories of being treated or mistreated because of the color of their skin or their gender, sexual orientation, that all of these things become critically important, and to acquire knowledge and learn about how better to deal with these and talk about them. And then when we're with young people and talking about these issues, we need to think about as processing it as any other stressor. Any other stressor, what we would do is we would empathize, right? As we saw the counselor in the video, to empathize and validate the experiences. That should not have happened. I'm sorry that you're going through that, right? And then educate. And some of that may be helping to understand, as the counselor did, that these things are traumatic, that these things do have an impact in your life, that they are real. You know, I worked with a young adult not too long ago, and he was still in his early 20s, and he worked in a setting. He worked as a para in a setting that worked with young people, and we had worked for a long time on depression that he was experiencing. He was an Afro-Caribbean male, and as we continued to work and he talked about sort of debilitating depression in his life, he had often talked about experiences that he had at work and not feeling quite good at work. And I never actually explored what that meant. And at one point he started talking about these microaggressions that he experienced in his workplace. A coworker that had come to this job at the same time he did had experienced actually a micro assault. One of the clients at this place had said that they did not want to work with her because she was a woman of color, and the agency obliged, and she was upset, and she confronted them, and she was fired. And he talked about that experience and how bad he felt for her, but also how bad he felt about being silent, and how bad he felt, and how he realized that he learned he's not to talk about that in the workplace, right? That's taboo, right? And but the important thing too, though, is that it was connected to his mental health. And even though he'd never talked about microaggressions or experiences with racism prior to that, and he talked about, in many ways, his depression coming out of nowhere, and that's what worried him. He didn't know why. We connected the dots and talked about the importance of those experiences and the centrality of those experiences to his mental health. And I have to tell you, in his case, it was like a light went off. I think it's because sometimes we see these problems as social problems and not psychological problems, not problems of mental health. And that's the part of the reframing that we need to do. So that's where the education comes in, and talking about how these absolutely have a role in mental health. Right? And then, of course, from there, support. And I'll talk a little bit in a little while about some ways in which you can provide support. But it's exploring those thoughts and feelings and behavior. So, so a couple of ways that we can explore these issues is, of course, to bring it up. So as we think about talking about and creating space in your practice or in your work with young people, you can create that space by asking them. This is just a brief script that's available to you, but you may at some point talk about how aspects of a person's background or identity can be very important, and explaining to young people or anyone you work with, you know, by background, I mean, for example, your race, the communities or groups that you belong to, the languages you speak, or where you or your family are from, or your gender or sexual orientation, or your faith or religion, right? Defining for them what we mean by social identities and why they're important. And then saying something like, it would be helpful for me to get your sense of how important these parts of your life are, and how important these parts of your identity are as we work together. So you can set the frame and you can set the stage. And what you're doing by addressing this issue is you're naming it, you're addressing it, and you're also creating a space where conversations about race are important and critical and important towards an important step towards healing. Okay. I oftentimes think that one of the reasons why we don't talk about race, and this kind of came out in the Jade scenario, is that oftentimes, I have to say, as practitioners, we sometimes view it as such a hot issue that we don't want to bring it up. We kind of think about it like child abuse or suicidality. you know, when you have a kid in your office and he starts talking and saying, you know, I'm just feeling really hopeless, I'm feeling really down, I don't know why. And you might sit there and you go, oh my God, I hope he doesn't, I hope he doesn't bring up suicidality, because then, oh no, right? I think we see it that way sometimes, and it is very different, because this has to do not necessarily with a symptom or a problem. It is about how they feel about themselves, but we kind of view it, because if someone talks about racism, we think we have to do something about it, right? And there are things you can do about it, but I think there's sometimes that paralysis that comes in. So creating the space to talk about and explore. And then, of course, you can go deeper and say, you know, is this something that you feel comfortable talking about? And then exploring what is the most important aspect of your background or identity. I worked with a young man not too long ago. One of the other things that I do in my own private practice is I do evaluations for asylum applications and folks who are applying for asylum in the United States. And I worked with a young man from Central America who identified as gay. And as we talked about his identities, it was really interesting. He was pretty much said he felt comfortable about being a gay man. The asylum application was about protecting him against the possibilities of returning to Central America and being targeted. And he had experienced death threats and had been harmed physically before. So that's what it really was. But when I asked him about his social identity, actually, it was interesting. One of the most important parts of his identity was his religion. He was deeply Christian. And I won't go into all the details, but imagine, and Christian to the point where he was very aware of the fact how his particular Christian faith looked negatively on homosexuality. But it was deeply important to him. That really was more harmful to him than his gay identity. He was fully confident in that, of course. So as we talk about those, it may be surprising to find out what's most important to folks. But then more importantly, right, are there aspects of your identity or background that help you or that you appreciate, right? Oftentimes that'll sound like the cultural traditions, right? I really loved growing up in my community. I love the foods. I love the traditions that we have, right? And then of course, are there aspects of your identity that are causing you concerns or difficulties? And of course, that should raise, or oftentimes does raise, questions around exposure to discrimination and racism. But all these questions kind of create that space. And then, so the question of what to do about it, right? So what do we do about it, right? Because as I said before, sometimes we have the fears of addressing it, like, what am I supposed to do with someone? And this, what to do about it, oftentimes, I will say, oftentimes comes up when there's a mismatch, right? A white person working with a person of color, or a cisgendered person working with someone who's trans, or a heterosexual clinician working with someone who is gay or bisexual, right? And oftentimes we think, and I actually teach a course at the Silver School of Social Work, our diversity course, and oftentimes, you know, many young future social workers will say things like, I don't know if I can connect, right? I don't know what I can do about helping someone deal with those things. So what can we do? Well, this is some work based on the research of Dr. Howard Stevenson. Howard Stevenson has done much work around racial socialization. So he's primarily worked in the African American community and the Black community around how do we socialize and help people deal, not only socialize people around issues regarding their social identity, but also how do we help them heal and how do we address them. So this is a kind of conceptualization and intervention that he's developed really to help young people, or help anyone really, address exposure and ways of coping with racial or discriminatory traumatic events. Okay? And what he says is basically, you know, start off by sort of obviously talking about it and identifying it. And you could say something on a scale of 1 to 10. How stressed are you about this, right? And then locate it within your body. Where do you feel it? Where does it come up for you, right? You might get butterflies in the stomach, or I feel it in the throat, right? Oftentimes, when you hear people say, I feel it in my throat, I feel like I can't talk, right? That speaks to the voicelessness that the trauma of marginalization oftentimes can promote. And then the next step is communicate. What are you saying to yourself during this experience? What's the internal dialogue? And it might be negative messages about themselves. It might be confusion. It's critically important to allow young people to express those, and then take a deep breath, and then engage them in diaphragmatic breathing, and to find that calmness, right? In CBT talk, we would call this habituation, right? Trying to allow someone to disconnect from the powerful feelings. And what's really important about this, and what we really have to oftentimes work on with young people, is that when we do this work, it's really important that what we're keeping in mind is that in these moments, what's important is to try to keep those negative self-messages from becoming deeply entrenched, right? Getting it outside, naming it, and getting it out of the individual, right? And as I said, for my money, these are some of the approaches that can address that internalized oppression and that internalized racism that people may walk around with. And then as we think of other strategies that people do use to cope with microaggressions, and this is part of understanding how people may cope differently. So some people may call out perpetrators, right? So we saw that very clearly with Jade, right? She named it. She confronted her teacher. She was very clear, calling out the perpetrators and saying it, right? And oftentimes this is where we have to be very mindful and very clear and validating, right? Because oftentimes, and I've seen this happen, where young people will say such and such was racist, or so-and-so treated me racist. And oftentimes, what might the response be? It could sound something like, well, are you sure that happened? Tell me what happened. Well, I'm not sure that was. We have to be mindful and validate and listen to the narratives and stories, even when people are obviously highly reactive, angry, upset, understandably so, right? Calling out perpetrators, but also seeking support. Sometimes people just find others who've gone through similar things and just vent and talk it out with others who might have similar experiences. Of course, seeking professionals who can advocate and having someone who can help them deal with these racist events and activities. And often getting it out and venting with families and friends, with family and friends. Sometimes the cognitive work of choosing a more positive outlook, believing in yourself. And again, this is why the work is so critically important, because for some people it is difficult for them to believe in themselves, and some may sort of identify these, sort of replacement strategies, cognitive replacement strategies, right? Instead of thinking I'm bad, I'm going to remind myself of how worthy I am, how strong I am. Sometimes that work is central to the work that you all do as helpers, right? Spirituality, some people turn it over to their God, their higher being, and think about more spiritual messages, empowering themselves and others, seeking education. So sometimes young people and older folks seek education about their own experiences. And as I mentioned, I teach a diversity course, and I had a student very clearly say, I as a result of being in our class, that she was going to take a deeper understanding and a deeper dive in understanding who she was as a woman of color, and sometimes choosing not to engage, sometimes using humor, and then of course self-care. These are oftentimes the strategies that you can use to help young people. And so I just want to end here by asking folks in this group, let's chat, please. One of the things that Dr. Jin Wright talks about is that this work is critically important, not only for the young people, but for ourselves. He emphasizes that healing-centered engagement also focuses on the needs of you all, the helpers. And I want to ask you all, if you want to chat in, if you feel safe and okay to chat in ways that you've been harmed or restored by your social identities. If you want to just quickly chat in a few of your experiences, and we mainly ask this as part of the idea that we as clinicians and as helpers and in the roles that we have, we're not immune to this. We also need to be working on our own healing. And that's one of the points that Dr. Ginwright talks about that's very different from other approaches. Being easily dismissed, restored, finding solace with the community, connecting to others within the community. Others, I'm still considered too culturally identified. And apologies, because for the sake of time, I would love to delve more into that. But Marilyn, too connected to my culture, and we often hear that, right? People being targeted because they dress a particular way consistent with their culture, or speak a certain way because of their culture. All these ways of being too culturally identified. Thank you for sharing. Others? Okay. Treated as unintelligent, bullied, fought back. As a white clinician, open up the conversation about color. You have to be, yeah. And I think this is why it can oftentimes be considered that hot topic and difficult to work through. I'm a female and identify as such. I have had traumatic medical experiences. So as we think about this work, as I said, going back to healing-centered engagement, part of this work is doing work on ourselves in this space that we talk about, connecting to our own need to feel fully connected to our social identities. So I'm going to move on. Now, this is a few other areas I want to mention. So these are some of the other areas of karma. As I said, we wanted to focus on that first one, but there are other aspects and other principles that guide healing-centered engagement from Dr. Ginwright's perspective. Agency, again, addressing hopelessness and helplessness, restoring and promoting a sense of power through collective action. And this idea of collective action can become so important, right? Because some of the work that we talked about a little while ago with the CLCBE approach, helping people sort of process and learn how to cope with microaggressions and exposure to traumatic events as part of their marginalized identities, right? We can also help young people channel that energy into collective action. We do have, and we will put up on the website, a toolkit that was developed that identifies groups that young people can engage in that help them to feel connected to the larger communities in which they live, that make them feel connected to their social identity. And then relationships, moving from transactional to transformative relationships. And one of the things that he talks about in that space is sharing vulnerability with youth, being able to think about how to effectively share your vulnerabilities with youth. I think even in that clip that we saw, the counselor saying, "I'm sorry, I misspoke. I shouldn't have done that." Oftentimes, right, sometimes that's kind of trained out of us, right? We should be okay with sharing our own vulnerabilities. That's just one small example. There are other examples in which we can share our vulnerabilities with young people and use it effectively. And then meaning helping young people identify their assets and what you do well and what you would like to improve on, and then their aspirations, exploring their dreams and goals. And so we actually, as I said, this is the part where we want to bring you into this. If this information that we provided to you today on healing-centered engagement and socially just care sounds like it's something you want to learn more about, what we wanted to do was ask you all. So we're gonna bring up a poll in a second, and we want to ask you, in your experience, what are the top 3 areas? Again, going back to these principles of healing-centered engagement that you find most challenging in your work in promoting in youth, especially youth with histories of trauma and adversity. And what we want you to do is, when the poll comes up, if you can choose, you can choose more than one, but we want you to choose your top 3 of areas that you would like more on. And we promise you that we'll provide more offerings in that space, depending on what we hear right now. So this is where we want to get your thoughts. So Kiara, if you could bring up the poll, thank you. Put your top 3 areas. And please try not to cheat and select all, because you could. But put in your top 3. Just kidding, folks. But put in your top 3 to give us a sense of what more we can share with you in this space, because again, this work on healing-centered engagement, we feel is really meaningful and helpful in promoting good practice. So let's take a minute on that.
And while we give folks some time to chat in, I do want to remind folks, if you have any questions, please certainly take the time now to chat those in.
Yeah, thank you, Diana. If you've already made your selections, we're going to go to Q&A in a second. So please, if you have any questions or thoughts. Oh. Someone said they didn't see the chat. I know sometimes if you're on a phone, or if you're seeing it on a phone or a smaller device, it might be a little difficult. Kiara, how are we doing on the poll?
Good. We have about 72 responses, so we can just wait maybe a couple more seconds to see if we get some last answers.
Okay. And just for me to know, Kiara, if I advance the slide, oh, well, no, you know what? Let me leave it there just in case. Okay. And Kiara, actually, if you could close this, the poll, just so that we have a good amount of time for Q&A. Okay. Oh, can you bring that back up again, Kiara? I saw it pop up. Okay, great. All right. So looks pretty evenly distributed, but I'm looking a lot at relationships and this idea of how to share vulnerability. And I think, so we kind of have a little hierarchy here, sharing responsibilities, certainly culture and more on processing social identity and helping young people develop a healthy sense of identity and agency. So our promise to you is that we will follow up and keep this in mind and develop more offerings in those spaces to address those issues and how we can work better at, promoting positive relationships, promoting agency, and helping young people develop a positive sense of identity. Thank you for that information and your feedback on that. And then with that said, please go ahead and submit your questions to the chat. You could also email me if you have any thoughts or questions about other offerings you want in this space. But do we have any questions coming up?
Yeah, we had a few come up, Jim. So one question is, how do we better understand those who disagree with us, whether the importance of equity and social justice or on the path to these goals?
That's a really good question. So on the path to racial equity, I think, and I'm not, please, Jason, Diana, your thoughts, but I do think that part of this work is to be clear and be able to give your position as clearly as possible, right? As we mentioned earlier, there's currently a very concerted effort. And one of the things that I see that's happening right now that's really concerning to me is a narrative that's coming out right now, which is, it is the person who talks about racism and tries to address racism that's the racist. I don't know if other folks are familiar with that dynamic right now. It's kind of part of the attack, for example, on things like critical race theory. There's a lot of disinformation out there about that. And so one of the things that I would simply say first and foremost is hold to your values. If you see and understand and consider yourself an ally and keep speaking truth to power. And then, of course, there are ways of doing that where you can listen to countering opinions, but be clear about your position, and find your voice on these issues and continue to speak to them. It is difficult, and you will have opposing opinions. You will have people that disagree with you, and trying to figure out that way of communicating it with where people will at least be able to consider and understand your point of view is oftentimes the most difficult task, but something that you can continue to work on. Jason and Diane, I don't know if you had additional thoughts.
Yeah, I would add to that. I would just say that I know how difficult it is to have these types of conversations, particularly when they mean so much to you as an individual. I would say that when talking to people, definitely holding your values, but also particularly within our work, facts matter, data matters. And I found the more facts that I can have and show someone to not only back up what I'm saying, but also help them to validate what I'm saying in their own minds, that's been extremely helpful, because I think that what we're seeing within media is a lot of opinions going back and forth. And people are taking those as if they're facts, but there's actual data out there. We have information at our disposal about disparities, about how people are treated and how people are viewed. So arming ourselves with those things is especially helpful, particularly when we're talking to people who have different viewpoints and may not have the same information that we have. So that's one thing that I found extremely helpful, but I definitely understand that it's a difficult thing to do.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Jason. And yeah, facts do matter. And I love that part of what you said, Jason, because I think, yes, we do have to be very clear about the information.
Great, thank you. We do have
any other questions?
Yes. How do we share our vulnerabilities, considering what we're often taught about self-disclosure and possibly sharing too much?
That is really great, and I'm glad that as the poll showed, that was one of the topics that folks wanted more on, and I think we certainly will follow this up and think about an offering in that to work in that space. I think, of course, as we often talk about with self-disclosure, yes, it is an element of our work, right? So we always want to be mindful that the work is about the people, the young people that we're working with and helping, and not about us. A few things. I mean, I think some of the work that I think about is a few things that the ways I think about self-disclosure, and actually this isn't mine. This is Irving Yalom's. Irving Yalom talks about self-disclosure in three ways. One is self-disclosure also means being clear about what you're doing and how you're operating and what your perspective is. I think we saw that with the counselor, right? She was clear in the way she defines trauma. She was clear in the way, clear-throated in her perspective on race and racism, right? So that self-disclosure, that's an element of self-disclosure. I think as the previous question kind of came up, how do you deal with people who have opposing opinions? There's going to be people, but as I said, being clear about how you feel about these issues and being able to communicate that's a part of self-disclosure as well. And so that's one part of self-disclosure, right? Our perspective on things, our views about things. And then there's the other piece that has to do, part of self-disclosure is what he calls the here and now self-disclosure. So, as young people, as you're working with young people, and I say this as a person of color, I've worked with young men of color, young African-American males who have said, see me as white. Oftentimes having that discussion, the here and now discussion. So when those issues come up about possibly questioning your bona fides, to have conversations about these, or you might do your own questioning about this, right? Being open about those aspects of the relationship, being able to process disruptions in the relationship. We saw that with the counselor as well. That's self-disclosure, right? I am sorry that I did that. And I think Jason said in a follow-up to that, she said, what can I do better for our work moving forward? That's an aspect of self-disclosure. The one aspect of self-disclosure that we oftentimes think about is how do we use ourself, right? The use of self in work. And I think that's also a process, trying to figure out And we have to be careful because we don't want to equate, right? Sometimes there could be a false equivalency. I am a white woman, and as a woman, I've experienced depression, so I know what your oppression is like. Of course, that doesn't work, right? So, but it is that use, that sort of effective use of self and connecting to your own experiences that might help to enlighten the young person that you're working with about that as well. So that use of self-disclosure, and obviously there's a lot more we could say about that, so we're limited in time, but those are the three areas that I think about. I know I'm mindful of time, but Diana and Jason, were any other thoughts that you had about that? And then we'll wrap up.
So with regards to self-disclosure, I think, it's an important topic. One thing that I often think about when sharing anything with someone that I'm working with is, what's the intended purpose behind this? Is this going to help them, or is this just something that I feel like sharing because I think that, I have a commonality there? And I honestly believe that self-disclosure is a really powerful tool when used for the right purpose. So if you think that sharing this information will help further your relationship or help build that bond between you and a young person and really help them to continue to progress, I think it's something that you have to take into account. But the idea that you can't share aspects of your life, I think at times is quite outdated. I think we're in a space where we're more effective by being our whole selves within the space that we're working.
And I just wanted to add, Jason, again, the clip that you showed was so great because if you do it and it doesn't work, there are things you can do to address it, right? Like the counselor did, right? I'm sorry, I don't understand, and I'm sorry if I misspoke, right? So there are also ways in which you can kind of repair that if it doesn't quite fall well. Well, I know I'm aware of time, so I just wanted to share, we have a long list of resources and references as part of this. I did want to highlight a couple of videos. So there's the video that we had of Jade. If you want to use that for training purposes or for your own educational purposes, we have that in the resources. As I said, we're also going to add a resource that identifies a number of organizations that help young people engage in collective action. So that'll be available to you. And then the CLCBE approach, there's also a link in here to a video that Dr. Howard Stevenson, who promotes that CLCBE to help cope with racial trauma, is in there as well. So you can take a look at these resources and we hope they'll be helpful. I did want to mention that we have a couple of upcoming events. Youth suicide risk, again, talking about youth, so there's a lot of work to be done here. Parental conflict as a traumatic stressor for children and adolescents. Key training. Key is an intervention that we developed internally for older adolescents, transition age youth, or older adolescents and young adults. Folks who are working with older adolescents and young adults would be interested in the key training, and then creative family therapy. Those are coming up. And again, we want to thank you for your participation today, and we hope that this has been helpful. And we do promise that we're going to have more follow-up on some of these topics in the future based on the feedback you've given us. And please complete the feedback survey at the end of this training. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Diana. Thank you, Kiara. Thank you, Ida, and the whole team for this work.
And thank you, Jim. Take care, everyone.